Hey, welcome students. Today we're going to continue our study of how to create form. We started this week and last week by talking about perspective and adding value to make our boxes look 3D. And then we did an observational drawing using pencils. So we're going to build on that knowledge, but we're going to talk about pen and ink techniques. And there are a couple words that you're going to need to understand, and I also want you to exercise by practicing some mark making. That's really key to being able to create form using ink. Usually when we think of ink, we think of it as just being black, so the blackness against the white paper. But it's really the mark making, using different marks to create the value that is what creates form when doing pen and ink techniques. So we're going to build on this knowledge of form, and we're going to talk about how to create value using ink. So it's not just black and white. And the way that you do that is by understanding texture. Using different kinds of marks creates different kinds of texture, which is important not only for a sense of realism and showing what things are actually made of, but it also adds interest to a drawing. So there are a couple other things that we're going to be talking about, and you're going to be ultimately practicing some of these marks. But I'm going to do a quick little demo for you. The first kind of mark that actually has a name are hatch marks. Hatching is when you create value using parallel lines. Parallel lines, as you know, never ever cross. So we're going to do some parallel lines here as an experiment. So we can just use straight lines for now. But we want to create the illusion that our value is getting darker and darker. Okay? So where there are fewer lines, the lighter is value. The more lines you put down and the closer together they are, the darker the value becomes. So we're really talking about a ratio of mark making to paper. The closer my marks get, the more I'm eliminating the whiteness of the paper. So I'm not coloring it solid. I'm just making my marks get closer and closer together. I'm just using simple, straight, horizontal hatch marks. Hatching, again, is parallel lines. They can be straight, they could be curvy. A famous hatching artist would be maybe like Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, if you know anything about art history, is famous for painting with lines. He just didn't fill things in solid or flat. He put the paint on in lines, which was very radical back in his day. So you can see here for my example, where the lines are very dense and close together, the value's dark. As there are fewer and fewer lines, the value becomes very, very light. So that's the first way, is hatching. The second way is cross hatching. When you create value by using layers of parallel lines that cross back over top. So using layers of marks. So one we could do is like what we just started, where we have parallel lines going horizontally. The more space in between them, the lighter the value. Okay, so that's using hatch marks horizontally. Now I'm going to cross back over the top with vertical lines. So I'm crossing over horizontally and vertically. Again, I'm putting marks really close together to make the value look darker. I'm not coloring solid. I want to try to get away from that. Here we could do diagonal lines. So I put a layer of hatch marks down, diagonally going from right to left, and then I can cross back over diagonally with diagonal lines going the opposite way. Makes it an interesting mark. If you compare the two, they look a little bit different. You can also cross back in more than one layer, or actually more than two layers. You can cross in one direction, diagonally the opposite way, and then you can add some verticals. So this is crossing, going all different directions. So it's really whatever your design needs. They don't have to be straight. Maybe you want to try and experiment with some squiggly lines that are parallel. This is very Vincent van Gogh-y. Maybe you want to research some of his artwork. Okay, so parallel lines don't have to be straight. We think of parallel lines as being straight, I think, because of math. When we think of parallel, we often think of equal signs. You get the idea. But just remember, it's the ratio, the amount of paper to the amount of ink. The more ink you put down, the darker the value becomes. Another mark that has a name is stippling. Stippling is a great texture. It's a lot of fun. You want to be gentle with your markers because creating stippling, you're creating value by gently tapping or bouncing the tip of your pen to create your dots. So the fatter the pen, the fatter the mark. Here we have a Sharpie. The regular Sharpie is much fatter than a skinny Sharpie. You can see the size of the tip is different. So I'm going to start with my big fat one, and I'm not killing it. I don't want to squish my pen, but I'm very gently creating some dots by tapping the pen up and down, almost like a sewing machine needle. This is a very controlled movement. If you're not careful, you can accidentally make check marks. It's kind of a bummer. You don't want that to happen, so you want to be very controlled. And again, it's very evident to see the closer the marks, the darker the value becomes. Stippling is a lot of fun, but oh my, it's a lot of work too. So think before you start using your value with texture. How much work do you want to put into it? This might be better on a smaller space. This definitely would be a great texture if you're trying to make something look maybe sandy. Okay, so this is what dots look like when you use the fat Sharpie. I'll lay that right there so you can remember what we did. And you can also try making some of your marks with a skinny Sharpie. Okay, of course I picked the dead one. There we go. Okay, much tinier dot, isn't it? It's fun sometimes to switch back and forth. You can use more than one type of pen within one mark. Makes it a little more interesting to have a little variety. This is great for filling in those little tiny spaces. It'll take a lot longer if you're using a tiny pen to make a very dark value. So I'm going to switch back to my big fat Sharpie, and I want to really make this end very, very dark. So again, when you bounce the tip of your pen up and down to make tiny little dots, that's called stippling. Okay, so those are the basic pen names, the pen and ink technique names. We had hatching, parallel lines. We have cross hatching, where you cross your lines back over, and then we have stippling. Big pens make big dots, little pens or thin pens make little dots. Okay, now last but not least, it doesn't really matter. You can make texture with any kind of mark making. So maybe you want to create a pattern that looks like sheep's wool. So you want to think about what might work. So maybe a swirly pattern like this would be good. Okay, maybe you want to make something look hairy or furry. It might look something like this. What does dog hair look like? A little bit like hatch marks, but you want to think about the texture of things. So I think that looks like fur or hair. Another one might be, maybe it's dots or maybe bumps. How are you going to represent bumps? Okay, so maybe something like that might be interesting. You can use your name over and over again. Any kind of repeated random mark is going to make an interesting texture. Maybe you want to use a special word like peace. Or you want to use your initials, a name. Maybe you want to use song lyrics to create a texture. You're limited only by your own imagination. So experiment. Okay? What else can we do? Maybe you want something that's spiky looking. Maybe there's spikes on the outside, spikes on the inside. Maybe spikes are like little cones. I don't know. If you look directly at it, maybe your spike looks something like this. Maybe it would change direction over here. What's that going to look like? Maybe you want to create scales. Scales are a little like brick. Ooh, brick. Brick would make a great pattern. Any kind of repeated mark will work. If you want it to be an actual texture, think about the natural world. Think about physical touch. Maybe you want to create wood grain. Maybe there's like a knot to the tree. Might look something like that. Maybe you're going to do tree bark. I don't know what tree bark looks like, but maybe it looks something like this. Okay, so just experiment, try different kinds of texture. If you're going to use the texture for value, maybe you want to practice making some of those marks closer and closer together. How can you control the value? You get the idea. So you're going to experiment with different types of mark making today. So remember, the closer the marks or the denser they are, the darker the value. As the space between the marks is bigger, the more space, the more paper there shines, so the lighter the value. So it's the ratio of ink marks to the amount of paper that controls the value. Thank you very much. You've been a lovely audience. Happy drawing.